The US has a major strategic problem. We are now deep enough into this war with Iran that a new fear has taken over the conversation. Is America burning through the exact high-end munitions that it would need for a war with China over Taiwan? That conversation is real and valid, but it also gets flattened into something much more dumb online, where every missile system basically gets thrown in the same bucket and every interception gets treated like proof that we're wasting millions of dollars trying to intercept basically flying trash. The real story is much more problematic than that, because some of the problem has been overstated, but the deeper readiness problem is absolutely real. And the most dangerous misconception of all is thinking that the Iran war has created the problem from scratch, when in reality, this is just exposing how truly unprepared America already was. The public version of this debate is way too simple. People hear that the US is firing interceptors, cruise missiles, and other expensive and exquisite weapons in the Middle East at targets that are half the cost of the munition that we fired, or even less. And they jump straight to the conclusion that America is draining the same stocks that it would need in the Pacific. Now that sounds intuitive, and in some cases it is true, but it also skips the most important distinction in the entire conversation, which is that not all high-end munitions have the same problem. If you don't separate the different categories of weapon systems that we're using right now, you end up panicking about the wrong things and missing the right problems. This is something that I wanted to speak with Colby Badwar. He's a U.S. Defense Industrial Base Procurement and Production SME, and he's also a friend of the channel, and I wanted to clarify all of this with him.
A large majority of the interceptor expenditures that we're seeing in the region are coming from the partner countries and not the United States itself. Now, we don't have definitive numbers, obviously. We're very much sort of relying on little bits and pieces of what the media has been told from their sources. But overall, based on where we see the videos of the impacts, where the missiles are being fired at, it's a very significant majority, even perhaps, that are going to the United Arab Emirates specifically. So that's very much the UAE relying on their own stockpiles, their own assets to take down those missiles and those drones. So I would say that the impact on U.S. stocks is probably not as high as people are assuming it is, because again, it's focused at the United Arab Emirates, it's focused on Israel, other countries in the region. So it's not as if all of these missiles and all of these drones are only falling on the United States to take care of that. So I would say that, again, without knowing definitively, that's what I would suggest strongly is what's happening right now.
That's why the first thing that really matters here is pushing back on the misconception that grows from misleading headlines and misinformation on social media. The next misconception is just as common and honestly even lazier. A lot of people online are acting like the US is just casually lobbing Patriot missiles at every cheap drone that Iran can throw into the sky, like American planners are running the world's most expensive skeet shoot. It makes for a great meme because the cost ratio looks absolutely absurd when you reduce it down to just one price of an interceptor versus the price of a drone, but this war is not a meme, nor is it as stupid as wasting millions of interceptors on cheap drones. And this is where a lot of the internet discourse begins to collapse in on itself. America is not routinely using the most exquisite systems in the dumbest possible way just because someone on social media wanted to make a viral chart. There are multiple layers to these defensive kill chains, multiple systems and people involved in multiple ways to thin out incoming waves before you get to the most expensive end of the ladder. So once again, the issue is not that the public concern is totally fake or wrong.
That's certainly not what doctrine is. That's not what the normal practice is. People like to make this comparison that's routinely what's happening, that the US is using some sort of very expensive, exquisite missile to take down a very cheap drone, and that's a situation and a weapon of last resort. So if you have nothing else, then by all means, yeah, you're going to fire what you have on hand. Because again, people, and I wrote a lengthy thread about this topic about, the whole concept of operations around missile defense and what it exists to do. When people consider the cost ratio question, they're often, ignoring, if that target is not intercepted, what does it hit? And what's the cost and the value of what it's destroying? More often than not, it's probably something that's a lot more valuable than the missile that you're expending. So, even in that situation, it should not be assumed that there's actually an unfavorable exchange there, because you have to consider the opportunity cost of what would get destroyed, right? So, but it's absolutely the case that the primary weapons being used to intercept these drones are going to be things like APKWS, or even Sidewinder missiles, which again are a little bit expensive, but still, it's you use what you have on hand. So it's not as if Patriot is only being relied on here. The United States and partner countries have a lot of different effectors that they can leverage to take down the drone threat. The drones, even though they are the primary threat, the advantage is that there are so many different things that can take them out. Whereas when you're considering the ballistic missile threat, you're relying on a very limited number of different options to intercept that class of threat. Whereas with drones, there are so many different options. So even though they do still present a challenge, the good aspect is that there are a lot of different ways to bring them down, and Patriot missiles are definitely not the primary weapon and not the main weapon based on all the available information that we see about the engagements. The UAE in particular is relying heavily on combat air patrol, and the United States has lots of different SHORAD assets, short range air defense assets, counter unmanned aerial system assets. Not enough, not nearly as many as they should have in theater, that much is clear, but they do have them. So it's not as if Patriot is the only system that's being relied upon.
The issue is that it gets framed so badly that people walk away thinking that the US is either recklessly wasting missiles or that none of this matters at all. And neither of those two things are true. It's one thing to fire off missiles and deplete the stockpile, but can we produce enough to recover our consumption rate? If some of the public panic is overstated, then which munitions actually trigger the bigger problem? That is where the conversation gets much more serious, because some categories are actually under more strain than others, and that distinction is what really matters, especially for Taiwan.
Tomahawk doesn't concern me as much as it does for some other munitions, for one primary reason, and that is the Tomahawk production line is operating very significantly below its maximum capacity, and this has been the case for a very long time. On average, we've seen perhaps as little as about 100 missiles per year between the United States' own requirements and production for foreign military sales customers, and that is against a current total production facilitization of 600 per year. So averaging around 100, that's how many are getting bought between all the services and foreign customers, versus 600 capacity. So the line is significantly underutilized and has been for some time because the Navy, the primary user, has just not been putting very much money into buying new missiles. And so if the Department of Defense and the Navy decides that they want to buy more Tomahawks, the capacity is there. Now, of course, the supply chain, these things take time as well, but it's not as if there needs to be a brand new Tomahawk production facility built from scratch in order to ramp up production. Like, the lead time will be significantly less because the capacity already exists. And Raytheon has already, with their framework agreement that they signed with the department, they want to ramp that up to over 1,000 missiles per year. So there's going to be significant capacity here. So the real question is the money going to flow to actually buy the missiles that there's room to produce here? So the Tomahawk inventory, within the expenditures that we're seeing, it can get replaced a lot easier than perhaps some other munitions can when those lines are already operating at maximum capacity, like Patriot, if we look at PAC-3 MSE, that's already operating above capacity, basically. Lockheed Martin is ramping up ahead of schedule and continue to ramp up, and they're going to ramp up even further, more than 300%. So that is happening, but that's above capacity. There's lots of other lines where it is below capacity, so there's a lot of room here to replace things if the money flows, because that's what's been missing. And I plan on writing more about this, because there's this sort of misnomer that the American industrial base and the broader sort of defense industrial base in the West more broadly, other NATO countries, other partner countries, that we all have this severe problem where we just can't produce it. It's just not possible. Just like it can't be done for whatever reason. And in many cases, the capacity exists. What doesn't exist are the orders. The government has just not put up the money to buy these missiles that industry could produce. But there's this sort of defeatist attitude that somehow, we're wasting these very finite stocks and we have no hopes of replacing them whatsoever. And that just is not an accurate reflection of the actual reality.
Now, this may have sounded like a technical distinction, but it's actually a whole strategic argument. If the issue is raw industrial capacity, then this war is exposing a structural weakness that cannot be fixed quickly. If the issue is under-ordering, then the problem is still serious, but it's also, and this is important, very political. It means the US has more production room to prepare than it used, as Colby said, but it's also trying to make up for lost time in the middle of a war, and even worse, it will have to sell to the American electorate that it will need to spend more money on defense to get ready for yet another foreign war after years of war fatigue and the electorate being told that there will no longer be any more dumb foreign wars. These wars may not necessarily be dumb, but the electorate largely can't tell the difference because our political leadership has a chronic communications problem. This is also why the Taiwan question needs to be approached very carefully and tactfully. One version of this argument says that the Iran war is the reason that America will not be ready to fight China. Another version is that the war matters and the munitions burn matters, but the production strain also matters, but the US is already behind before the conflict ever started.
The United States has been playing from behind for many years, and this is a very important point to emphasize because there's this narrative emerging that the United States, was prepared or was close to being prepared for these contingencies in Indo-Pacific Command in East Asia, and because of the war in Ukraine and because of what's happening in the Middle East, that now they are not prepared anymore because these munitions have been wasted. When in reality, the United States was not prepared prior to the war in Ukraine. They were not prepared, prior to October 7th. They were not prepared prior to the 12-Day War. They weren't prepared before Persian Gulf War number 3 now. The United States has never really been prepared. For as long as, China was formally identified as the facing threat at the sort of beginning of the Biden administration, but you can go back and look to President Obama's sort of pivot to East Asia strategy, which was back in 2011, 2012. And at no point has the United States really been adequately prepared from a munitions perspective or a broader defense readiness perspective to meet this growing threat emanating from the People's Republic of China. And so they won't be prepared next year either, because again, we're still just waking up. Only now are the politicians finally starting to get it. And we're still have a long way to go here, as I've said, with the defense spending necessary to buy the munitions. And so, again, we shouldn't be defeatist about this. It's possible, but a lot of time has been wasted. And if it weren't for these wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, people would still not have realized the problem. The experts have been sounding the alarm for a long time, but the policymakers, both in the United States and in Europe and other countries, have really just not appreciated this magnitude of the challenge and the threat here.
This is the part that should make everybody watching this video deeply uncomfortable, because it does make me uncomfortable. Once you understand the point that Colby's made, the debate stops being about whether one more war used up America's readiness. Instead, it becomes a much harsher indictment about how poorly the US has approached procurement, production, and defense planning in the first place. And worse, it's about how it totally failed to communicate this to the American public. It means America walked into an era of overlapping global conflicts without enough margin, and without enough surge built in, without enough urgency to correct the issue in the first place. And so now every new conflict feels like it is draining readiness, because readiness was already thinner than it looked in some pretty key and important areas. And that leads us to the final verdict. No, the US is not just flat out running out of missiles, nor is every viral stockpile panic post just automatically true. But yes, as we've seen here, there are categories of weapons, especially the high-end, exquisite interceptors and other difficult to replace systems, where the strain is very real and the timelines absolutely matter. And yes, if America wants to be ready for both the war that it is currently fighting right now and the war that it may have to fight very soon in the Pacific, then the answer is not just comforting rhetoric that reinforces bias, nor is it turning isolationist and abandoning treaty obligations and allies. It's bigger orders, faster production, deeper stockpiles, and a defense industrial base that looks like the one that Chinese propaganda says that it is. Because in the end, the Iran war is not just testing whether the US can dominate air over just one battlefield. It's testing whether America can absorb a real munitions burn without undermining its next deterrence challenge against a much, much more capable foe, no less. So a huge thank you to Colby for being so generous with his time and his expertise. His Twitter is linked below and you should absolutely go follow him. Linked below his Twitter account on the description is a thread from him on missile defense that is very interesting. Like this video if you found it helpful or informative, and comment on what you thought about this kind of interview structure. I've done interviews before on the channel, but this is kind of the first time I'm trying to do it in this way.